Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to be in this video going over how to set up the client side of the website. So we're going to be doing this in React, and Facebook has a really nice setup tool called Create React App that makes it super easy to set up a React application. So if you just do Create React App, and then I'm going to call mine client, it'll go ahead and run. I'm not going to go ahead and enter this because it takes a while to download some of the dependencies, but when that's done it will create a folder called client, and I'm just going to go into that and it'll install all the dependencies that we need for React. But there's some additional ones that we want to use for this specific application. So if you just do npm install, we're going to install a couple of other packages. We're going to need these three feathers packages for communicating with the feathers server, and we're going to use that later to log in. And then we're going to be using Redux, so we're going to download Redux and React and Redux. We're going to be using react-router to serve up the different pages, the login, the sign up, the create a recipe page, and then also redux-saga, which I'll talk about later, which is how we're going to actually make API calls to our Feather server. And then lastly, superagent we're going to be using with Feathers. That's how we're making the API calls as well. And semantic-ui is going to help us make the website look nicer and use some of the components, some semantic-ui. So I'm not going to run this because I've already run it before. But once you're done with that, you'll have all the dependencies we're going to need for the project. So if we just look at what's inside this folder that they made, we have readme, node, modules, a package, and then our source code is in source. But what we can do is just go ahead and start up the server. So if I do npm start, that'll start up the server that the Create React app created for us. So if we just go to, should open it for us. Go to localhost 3000, and here we go. I'm just going to switch this over here. Okay, so we have this nice little pop-up window here that we can build out our app in. So I'm just going to let that run in the back end. I'm going to switch to a different tab in my terminal. So if we go into the source, we see a bunch of different files. Now they have some CSS and other things which we're just going to get rid of and start ours all from scratch. So you can get rid of app.css, you can get rid of app test, index.css, and then the logo.svj. So if we go into app.js, we're not going to need any of this stuff. We can just make sure it's working, we'll just say hi. So we can create an h1, and we'll get rid of that stuff. We don't need those imports. Now if we go to index, we can get rid of, we still need the app, but if we can get rid of this CSS right here. Now if we save that, the cool thing about this application, or this server that was set up for us, is it auto refreshes the page for us and loads in the components. So now we see hi there, perfect. Now we can start actually putting in our content in. So first we kind of need to set up the infrastructure of our application and start setting up kind of our components, Redux, our routes, and that sort of thing. So we're going to create a couple folders. Actions, which will be the actions for our Redux. Components, which will put all our components, React components, the home page, recipes, that sort of thing. Then we'll have the reducers for Redux. Then we'll have sagas, and sagas will be we'll talk about sagas a little bit later. We'll just start with these for now. Now I'm going to move the app.js into the components, and then I'm going to work on index.js. So in our index.js, what we want is we're going to keep these imports here, but now our app is actually in components. And then we also are going to be making a another component called home, which will kind of act as our home page. So we'll go ahead and import that, which we'll create later. And now we're going to get some React router components. We're going to get router, route, index route, and we're getting this from React router. And now we want to get the provider, and this is for Redux. And then we get also the store, history, app, and we're going to create a local store file, which we'll get this stuff from. Now, store is the Redux store. History is for the history of the React router. And then this app guy is something we're actually going to add into the store. This is going to be our feathers application, which we actually don't need for now, so we can actually just get rid of it. We'll use that later for authentication purposes. So we'll add that to store later. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to create a router. So const router. Go ahead and we're going to do a provider. At the top level, this is going to keep our store. We want to do curlies. And we're going to close it. And now we're going to have a router. And we want to keep the history. And now we're going to create a path. So that'll be a route, and we want this to just be basically the home page or the index, the first page. And when they do that, we want to load up the app. This will have some configuration things in it, which we don't really have to, which we kind of want to happen on no matter what route they go to. So when they come to the home page, basically whenever they come to any page on our website, we would like this app to be run. And so now we want to set up our index page, which will be our index route. And this will be the component we're going to use as home. So what's happening here is it's going to load the app component, and then once the app component is loaded, it'll then search and figure out which route it wants. If we're going to just the home page, it'll give us the index route and serve up the home component. Okay, awesome. So now instead of app here, since we have app being loaded here, we actually just want to do the router. Okay, cool. So now our index page is all set up. And we can go into setting up the store next. So if we're going to go store.js, create one in the folder we're in, and now let's go ahead and import some functions we're going to be needing. So we're going to use create store, apply middleware. We're going to do this from Redux, and we're going to sync this up with our router history. And here's where I want to start talking about redux-saga. We're going to be using Saga to make API calls from our application. And how that works is Redux uses pure functions. So how pure functions work is they have no side effects, or they're not talking to a database. They're not making API calls like we want to. You put in an input, they spit out an output, and that's all there is to it. But how do we actually make API calls then for Redux? And the way you do it is with sagas. It's a library that helps you do this, and what happens is it'll make a call to, whenever you want to make an API call, you would call the Saga. The Saga makes a separate thread, runs it in the background, and when it gets the result, calls Redux, and Redux can update the state with whatever value that the Saga got from the API call. Now that might be a little confusing right now. It'll make more sense later. So right now we're gonna just set up the Saga so we can write that later, but we're gonna connect everything up. And then I'm gonna create a Saga in a little bit, and I'm gonna create that in a Sagas folder. So we haven't actually created this yet, but we're gonna do it in a minute. We also can get the root reducer, which we have not set up yet, but what's going to be in our reducers folder. We're going to create that. I like to set up kind of a reducer for each part of the application. It kind of separates things and then combine them all together. So you'll see what that is. It makes it a little bit easier to write your code. And the next thing we want to import is superagent. Get this from superagent, and this is we're just basically initializing the feathers client that we're going to be using. So let's import some of the stuff we need for that. Feathers rest, and we can create a default store, which for now we'll just leave empty. And we're going to create some middleware, and this will be our Saga middleware. This just allows Saga to be called through actions. This will make more sense later. This is basically just wiring everything all up. So let's create the store and pass in our root reducer, our default state, and then our apply our middleware on the Saga middleware that we got right here. Awesome. So now we're going to set up our application, because you'll see in our application later we're going to have to be using our feathers app in multiple places. So basically we want to keep this object and pass it every time we make a Saga call. So for this, our host is going to be localhost 3000 or 3030. That's kind of where our backend is running. We're going to want to change that if we put this into production. Now we're going to export this app. This is the app I was talking about earlier in the index that we are importing. We're actually not going to need it in the index right now, but we'll need it later. So we're just going to initialize feathers, and we need to configure it. Get it with the rest. We're passing in the host, and we want to connect superagent. That's the HTTP client that we want to use. Configure again. Just makes it really easy to use. Set up hooks. And then lastly, authentication. We won't be doing authentication now, but we'll need that later in application. So let's go ahead and just add it now. And for authentication, we're going to use local storage. Okay, all our curlies and parentheses are matching up. Excellent. And then we just need to actually run the middleware. And we'll call our Saga. And then we're just going to pass in the app. And this app will be passed into our functions. And now we're just going to export the history. Passing in the browser history and the store. And of course, exporting our store. Awesome. So our store is all set up. Now you see we have some other things we need to set up. We haven't done this root reducer. We haven't made this my Saga yet. So let's go do those. So let's create a Sagas folder. So now we have actions, components, reducers, and Sagas to do. Let's actually start with actions, because those are relatively simple and straightforward. So let's create a file in our actions folder called action creators. .js, and we're just going to have one. Now when we come onto the home page of our application, we would like to see the most recent recipes. So let's create a function called recent recipes, and all we're going to do is create a type recent recipes requested. And so what's going to happen is whenever recent recipes is requested, we're going to go make an API call to our Feathers server that we set up, get the recipes, and then serve them on the home page. And that's the only action that we need for now, so we're done there. Let's go ahead and tackle the reducers. Actually, let's do the sagas first because the sagas influence the reducers. So if we go into sagas, we're going to create in sagas, we're going to be creating a file called sagas.js, and in this file first we need to import some stuff. We're going to be importing I believe it is sagas from redux-saga, and down below, we're going to be using also take every, and actually I don't think we're going to need this for that. We're going to use fork call and put instead from redux sagas / effects, and then import get recent recipes. Now this is something we're going to be creating. This is going to be a function call that actually calls our API. So we'll create a folder, a services folder, and an API file, which we'll store that in. So we need to create this guy still. Create a browser history and react router. Awesome. And actually we'll be using browser history later. I'll leave it there for now when we're actually making some authentication things and redirecting pages. So let's create the root default function root feathers app yield, and we're going to fork recent recipes saga, which we need to create this function, and then feathers app. Now this feathers app you see right here is the we don't need that semicolon. This is the function that we passed in the store. So if we go back to our store real quick, you can see right here we're passing in this app. This app right here is going to be passed into our root. We're done with that. So this is what we're going to use. We're going to pass this on to the API so it can make its calls. So let's create this recent recipes saga. So function star recent recipes saga, and you'll notice these functions have stars next to them because they're using the yield keyword, and this is happening asynchronously. So we want this to be called whenever the action recent recipes requested is called. And when that's called, we would like to fetch recent recipes. This is a function we'll be making. And then we'll pass in the feathers app. Now, you notice this is the same as in our action. So whenever that action is called, it'll trigger this right here. So let's create this fetch. fetch recent recipes, feathers app const recipes is equal to yield, call get recent recipes, passing in the feathers app as a parameter. And then once we are done with that, we're going to create an action, recent recipes. Instead of requested, we're going to assume it succeeded. And then we'll pass the recipes. Okay, so what's happening here is first we are listening for this action to be called. Whenever this action is called, we will then call this function. And when this function is called, we're going to create a call to our API, get recent recipes, return that here, and then we're going to dispatch another action, which we're going to handle in our reducer with the recipes. So we're all done here. So there's two things we need to set up next. The reducer, which we'll be using for both our action and when this succeeds. So if we can do that next, and then also we need to set up this API. So if we go to reducers, we can create a recipes reducer, which we'll export function. Now we'll call this recipes, and let's export default at the bottom. Let's do this at the bottom. And then at first, we're gonna have no recipes. You need to set a default state. So how you set up Redux functions or reducers is you have the state as one parameter and the action as the other. And remember when right here in our action, we have this type. Whenever an action like this is called, it will come over here and pass this here. So we can do action.type and check what type of action it is. And then we're also past the state. Now the state will set by default as just an array, and then we'll fill that array once we get recipes. So first we want to check and make sure the action is the right type. So we'll check the type of the action. If it's now we don't care if it's requested, because that's when the saga is called. We only care when it's succeeded. So we can also get rid of this now, and we will call recent recipes succeeded. Okay, so if it's equal to that, then we are going to take the recipes and put that into the state. And we can put it into the state by just returning the recipes. Now if we do go to default, we can return state. You always want to add this so there's something being returned. Okay, so we're done with this reducer. Now we can create the root reducer, which we'll call index.js. And in this guy, we are just going to be tying all our reducers together. In this case, we only have one reducer right now, but later we're going to have more. So we're going to use combine reducers from Redux, import router reducer from react router. Oops. And the only other thing we're going to be needing is the actual recipes function that we just created. And now let's create the root reducer. It's going to be a combined reducer, and right now we're just going to have the recipes and then the routing. And this will just give us some routing information. Cool. Now just export that so other functions can use it. Default root reducer. Okay, so we're almost done. We have the reducers all good to go. The things that are left to do are the action, or not the actions, the components and the API. So let's do the API next. So let's create a folder called services, and in that folder we'll create an API, and this will where all our APIs calls will be. So let's create a function and export it called get recent recipes, and this is that same thing that the Saga will be calling. Pass in the Feathers app, and then we're going to be looking for recipes. So if we do app.service, remember how we created a recipes service? The app knows about this and grabs it, and then we will just return recipes.find. And then what we're looking for is the most recent recipes. So we're going to query, and we're going to sort by created at by -1. This is how we would like to find it. So then do then data error. I mean, we're not going to worry about errors right now. Data. So that we're just going to return the data given back to us. So this is how we would like to find the recipes. But right now, we don't have created at in our objects. So if I'm just going to open our tab and go look at our backend that we set up. So if we go to our backend, and if you go to data, that's kind of the data stored in the database. So if we go to recipes, we can see, if you remember, follow along in our last video, we added these two to our database, and you'll notice there's no created at, so they actually cannot be sorted by that. So we're going to have to add that in as a hook later on. So for now, we are not able to do this. We're just going to be using get and not worry about that. And we'll be coming back to find. Alright, awesome. So this should be all set up. So lastly, let's set up our components. These are the actual views and what they're going to be looking like. The first thing we need to set up is the app.js, and now we're going to be changing this up a little bit. This is going to be called every time our function, or not our function, our website is loaded. So it's not really going to be a component, it's more of like a thing that's getting loaded before everything else. So we can get rid of all this stuff. Instead, let's create some import statements. We're going to be needing bind action creators. This allows us to call our actions that we created in our actions folder. And we're going to get connect from react-redux. This connects all the state, and as action, this is actually getting all the actions, which we put in our actions folder, action creators. And we're going to be creating a main component in a second, which will kind of wrap all our components. And then we're going to map state to props state. Now what this is doing is, if you remember in our reducer, we said we're going to be passing in actions.recipes. We're pass that right in. Well, that'll be in state.recipes, and basically it just allows you to put this inside and have all your components be able to access it. And we could name this recipes, and this is in our state right now. This guy right here is going to have all our recipes that we want, and we're just storing this in this object. So this is just taking it out of the state and putting it in a location where the components are going to be able to touch it. So we're also just going to set up a dispatch function. This allows to call the actions from the props, which you'll see in a minute when we set up the other components. So pass in action creators and dispatch. So const app, and we're just going to connect everything together. Map states to props, map dispatch, and then we're just going to call that main component. So let's set up that main component next, which we'll be using to tie everything together. So components .js. So this is kind of like an outer. This is going to be a component. It's going to be like the outer layer of our application. So component from React. This is kind of where our header is going to be that we want on every page. Let's create a link. This allows us to make basically anchor tags. React router, and we get the header, container. This is just some things to make it look nice. Now create our class, inherit from components, component, and now we create a render function, and we're going to return. We're going to just wrap everything in container, and then we want a header, and we want it to be an h1. I'm going to call this, and of course, make it in the center. And then I want to wrap this, and the inside I want to put my text, and I want to put my link so we can click on it and go to the home page. And I'm going to call this menu monkey. You can call this whatever you like. /link. And now the last thing I'm going to do is every I want all the other components to be kind of inside of this main. And to do that, we're going to do react.cloneElement. This.props.children, comma, this.props. Okay, so what that does is it grabs all, like for example, we would like the home page. So if we go back to our thing right here, we're not actually calling main anywhere. When we call app, we're then connecting it with main, and main is going to be on top of home. So by doing that copy thing that we just did, the clone, what that actually does is passes the props to home, so props can now call actions and see the information that it needs. So let's set up home next. So components home.js. So of course this is going to be a React component. Component from React. Import recipe list. This is going to be a custom component that we're going to make, and this is just to divide everything a little bit. We're going to get a divider from semantic-ui. Alright, awesome. So home extends component, and we're just going to render, return. We're just going to create a div to wrap everything, and then a divider, and then we're going to just show our recipe list on the home page, and this is going to be that list of recipes. And we just want to export default home. Okay, so let's set up our recipe list now. Create a recipe list file in our components. It's going to be a React component. We're going to be using a card view from semantic-ui. And then what we want to do is we want to show like a big group of cards. And we might want to use cards everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a custom recipe card component, which we'll set up next. And then here, what we'll just do in this one is create a group that'll have a bunch of cards. So in the constructor props, super props. Now, what we'd like to do is whenever this page loads, we would like to, or whenever not the page loads, because we could add other stuff in the home. For this recipe list to load, we need to actually fetch recipes. Now remember how we actually trigger recipes to be fetched is we call that action. So if we go to props, this.props, we had a recent recipes action. And this will dispatch that action, and then our saga will be called, and it'll make an API call. So this is we want to happen whenever this is loaded for the first time. So we're going to just render, turn. We're going to create a card group. And I'm going to say 5 per row. And now I'm just going to map recipes. So remember when we did this.state recipes in our app? So right here, we're going to be using this. It puts this in the props, so then we can do this.props.recipes right here. And we're going to map that, and we're going to create a little function. So we're done with that. So the first thing, we'll have the recipe for each one in the array, and then we'll get the index. And we're going to create a recipe card for each one, passing the props. And we need to give it a unique key, so redux or react knows when to refresh it, and then we're just going to pass the recipe in. Awesome. So basically what it's going to do is it calls the API, it gets the recipes, and then for each recipe it's going to be creating a recipes card on the page, showing that. So let's create the recipe card now. If you just go to components, create a recipe card.js. So this is React component from React. Is there anything else we need to import? I don't think so. So we're just going to create a recipe card, and that extends component. We're just going to create a, this is going to also need, we're going to be creating a card, forgot about that, from semantic-ui. I'm going to use that to render. Okay. So in the constructor, we'll set up the constructor in a second. We're going to create recipe. We're going to render, return, or the first thing we want to do is get the recipe from this.props. And if you're not familiar with the syntax, this is the same as doing const recipe is equal to this.props.recipe. And then we're going to be returning. So this is just getting the recipe from the props so I can use it easily. We're going to be creating a card. It's going to be centered. gonna have an image. This would be recipe.image URL. Header will equal recipe dot name. Meta will equal description. For now we're not going to have it on click. We'll add that one later. Description recipe dot description dot substring. In case the description is kind of long, we'll cut off at 100 characters and we'll add an ellipse. Okay, so we're all done with that. Export default recipe card. Now I can't remember if we exported a recipe list. Let's make sure we did. Nope, we didn't. So export default recipe list. Awesome. Now let's go back over and see if we have any syntax errors, which it looks like we do. So was it saying it does not like unexpected token? And let's go figure out what that is. So that's in our store. So vim store. So we have an unexpected token. Apply middleware. I don't see why. Oh, that's why. That shouldn't be there. Okay, and then let's look at our recipe card. Vim recipe card. What doesn't it like? Oh, we need to close our card. There we go. Anything else? Browser history is not defined in store.js. Oh, you're right. We did not do browser history, so let's get that. Import browser history from react-router. Very nice. Reload. Module not found. Redux-sagas. Oh, it looks like it has a problem with our sagas. Let's look at our sagas one more time. Let's see. I think it doesn't like our... Oh. I had an extra S. That's it. It's redux-saga, not sagas. And again there. Oops. See, for refreshes. Okay, awesome. So now it's actually loading. If we look at the console, we should be getting error because we don't have our server running right now. So we're getting a warning. Type should be null. It should be a string for React cache. Check the connect. Uncaught error. Element type is invalid. Create a string for the built-in components. Got an object. Check render method. Okay, so we're getting different errors than I thought. So let's look at why we're getting these. So main is never used, is defined but never used in main.js. Let's look at that warning first. Components. Oh, so that's a problem. We didn't export default export default main. And browser history is never used. Oh, okay, that's an unused. Okay, so this is the error I was thinking we were gonna get. So we have our server is down, and that makes sense because it's getting an error. But what you can do, if we go to open up a new tab in my terminal, so I'm going to go back to that backend tab. I'm just going to start it up. Now we should still get an error because if we go back to our recipe card, we said the recipe.image URL, the recipe.name, and all this stuff. And if we go back to our backend, oops, and we look at the data, we don't have any of that stuff. We have a name, we have ingredients. But right now we don't have a description, we don't have an image URL. So if we go back, refresh the page maybe, so we're getting an uncaught property because we don't have this description. So what we could do, we can just delete that for now, forget about the image, and just see if we can show this name right here. Okay, it looks like that's showing up. Now if we go to connect to React, we can actually see if we click on, I believe main will have it. This is a Chrome extension for React, so you can see it as this other React tab right here. So it allows me to look at the props for each component. So I'm looking at this main that we created, and I just want to show you guys that the recipes that we fetched that are in the Redux store. So if we click on recipes, we can see the first one. We have directions, cook for 10 minutes. We have ingredients. This is our broccoli sauce. You can see it says broccoli sauce there. You can see broccoli. We can see broccoli sauce, olive oil, broccoli there. Okay, very cool. So that's showing up. And it looks like my semantic UI downloaded kind of funky. So I'm going to look into why it's not rendering nicely. In the next video, we will set up the rendering of this so it looks nicer, assuming yours also looks like this. It might look nice. And then also I will set up the images looking nicely, and we'll sort them by date and that sort of thing. So thanks for watching. We set up the basics of the redux-saga and the React router components. Now it's going to be easier to add on for future videos.